everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Denise Mina to talk about the new historical novel, Three Fires, but I'm sure we will talk about much, much more. Hello, Denise.
Hello, Alistair. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. So let's start with Three Fires. How do you describe it to people like me when we ask these things?
It's quite difficult. It's a very slight book. Now, the idea of these was I was inspired by Borges and his Universal History of Infamy, in which he said you can tell these stories in glimpses. So it's taking on very big stories like Rizzio or Savonarola in Florence and telling them in scenes rather than great overarching historical, chronological tomes that sort of show other historians that you've read all the books. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's just to keep it narrative, to make it narrative. So it's the story of Savonarola, who is often outshone by the glitzy Medici, who were very bling and were there in Florence at the same time. There was so much going on in Florence at that time that he's quite a dour character and tends to get forgot. His story is always like a beat point in someone else's story.
Right.
And I just think he's amazing. I think his story is there are actual miracles.
Yeah.
There's a lot of fire. It is the start of the Renaissance. I mean, it is really the seeds of the Enlightenment when he starts to talk about it. So much of it's contemporary. You know, they're talking about sort of universal theology is a thing then, like bringing together all of the faiths of the world and, you know, where the overlaps are. So it's called Three Fires because three fires is a big symbol in Buddhism.
Right.
And it's the three fires it's the three poisons that will bring you into bad living. And but Savonarola's life was also marked by three fires. And he is like the very first kind, for me, the very first documented populist uprising. So he's reflected on so much that goes on in the rest of Europe.
So was this a story you were already familiar with?
It was a story I was vaguely aware of, that there was someone sort of, you know, kind of party pooper in Renaissance Florence. But I actually became obsessed with it slightly because I heard about him on a podcast episode of a podcast called Bad Gays.
Right.
Which is about, they say it's about complicated and difficult people in queer history, which, you know, in a defensive history, you just hear about the good guys. Do you know what I mean? But actually, people are people. So, they were talking about him in the context of a poet who lived in Florence. And what really sort of caught my eye was they said Florence was the San Francisco of its day. So it's where all gay people went to be safe. And because of the oppressive numbers, you know, homosexuality was very open. Yeah. It wasn't a big deal. And, you know, there were taverns, there were customs, there were festivals. You know, Botticelli had a boyfriend, Da Vinci had a boyfriend, Michelangelo had a boyfriend. Well, no, I don't think Michelangelo did have a boyfriend, but I don't know why, I'm almost certain he was gay. But Donatello's David, you know, I read an article a few days ago saying, is this a gay statue? And of course it is. I mean, I've always known it was. But it's like this history keeps being uncovered. So that was sort of like what brought me into it. And Savonarola was very homophobic. He was very, it wasn't called homophobia then. He was very much against anal sex. That was his big thing, which is kind of like, you know, sort of entry position, if you'll excuse the pun, for homophobic commentators. And so but he also had some really great ideas like credit unions. And, you know, he appealed to the masses by saying things like poor people are not responsible for their poverty. So these absolute truths that no one had heard before. He's very insightful. And then he would segue from that to we need to kill the Jews.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you know, so it's that very populist thing. Trump does it sometimes, of identifying real problems, being straight about them. It feels very startling and people are quite disarmed. And then he comes into it with a call to action to build a wall or, you know, attack migrants or remove birthright citizenship, things like that.
He's such a complex character, although in some ways very straightforward because he knows what he believes and he sticks to his guns right the way through. But as you say, you read him, you think, oh, this is really heroic, his stance against the Catholic Church and the excess and all of those things. And then you go, and then, you know, he'll say, but the Sodomites and the Jews, however, and you go, so it's really interesting, like the book is as a whole, to read it through modern lenses.
And he was so misogynistic. I mean, he didn't even want to speak to women, which I think is fascinating, you know, because, you know, we do talk about the struggle of feminism in micro terms now, but you forget that we were not citizens for so long. And, you know, that basically women were just bred to death.
Yeah.
You know,
The kind of start, I suppose, in the book of his almost fanaticism is this being humiliated and rejected by a woman, which, going back to Trump, took me in mind of the story of Trump apparently deciding to run for office because Barack Obama had kind of roasted him at something, and he says, right, I'm going to show you. And then the result of that, you know, with people storming the White House, there were parallels there as well. You've got this guy who has followers, fanatical followers by the end, who, you know, run through Florence and do their thing. So was that rejection at the beginning? Did you see that as a key moment?
I do think it's key, and I don't want to sound petty or, you know, women are responsible or that it was a small moment in his life, because I think it was huge. It was the last point at which he would not follow this course of action, I think. And I think, so he's rejected by a very posh girl who says, you're not as posh as me. And he actually denies it quite a lot later in his life. But his brother says it happened. And then after his brother dies, he stops admitting that it happened, which to me suggests it's very significant. But what happened after that was almost immediately, there was an incredibly violent and civil war in the city he was living in. And so I think there was this rejection that he might have processed. And because that happened, he just never really got his head around it. I mean, I think those you know, gigantic, you know, people with a sense of, you know, history changing mission very often are quite petty. They would call it looking for guidance, but it is actually quite petty events that happen to a lot of people. And also he was very grandiose in the way that Trump is. So he really saw himself as a historical figure from, you know, he could not, I mean, the thing about grandiosity is punctured, it's very dangerous. I mean, I think if Trump gets back in, the real danger is the point where something goes really wrong for him, or if he goes to prison or something like that. I mean, apparently, towards the end of his premiership, the military were keeping the nuclear codes from him because they recognised that this was a very dangerous point, you know. And I think that you know, the sort of deflation of those grandiose ideas of youth, we all go through them. You know, being a teenager is humiliating, and you know, most of us just say to your pals, "Oh no, he's chucked me," and you get over it. But it is a lot to process, and I think we forget that, you know, and I think he just never did.
And this is, again, you know, you don't want to, I understand you don't want to make too much of it, but he's really humiliated, you know, in the way that it kind of goes on. And then he does what I think I might have done at the time and go a different way down the road so that you wouldn't have to see the people and all this. It's very relatable in that sense. But then, as you say, what happens next is more extreme, and then that almost pushes him to, is it an extreme point of view, or is it just he is railing against what he sees as corruption?
Well, I think it's a faith mindset.
Yeah.
So I think he really believes that he alone can see the corruption in the Catholic Church, and he alone is slightly suicidal, and which means that he is brave enough to say there is corruption in the Catholic Church. So it is like, you know, a kind of point of, it is a motive. He is kind of motivated by despair, I think.
Yeah.
And because he's the only one that sees that, he feels he has to point that out. That's the mission of his life. And it takes him so long to get any kind of power. And he's quite, you know, he's far into it, and he cannot speak publicly. He's rubbish. He basically speaks with a Birmingham accent and a lisp, and he can't project his voice. So what he does, he's so convinced of his mission. What he does is he goes off and learns how to speak. It's Arturo Ui. Over the course of 10 years, he learns how to have charisma. And which I find he does the clubs, he does that for 10 years. I think that's amazing.
I mean, it's just so relatable. You think, I've got so much to say, but I can't say it, or you're not willing to listen to me say it the way I am at the moment. He's got a kind of big audience, and then row by row they start to leave, and then he's just there with the people who are really looking for a bit of shelter and quiet.
Yeah, he was left with a lot of women and their children, which, I was brought up Catholic, but women, at that time, when they were in church, it was the only time they were not working or giving birth. And they could all they have to say to the children is be quiet. So it's like a big rest for women to go to chapel, which I think explains why so many women were so religious.
And these ideas, they set off actions that would result in the bonfire of the vanities. Again, something I knew very little apart from the Tom Wolfe book. So it was interesting doing a bit of background reading to that and thinking, these are the ideas, this kind of destruction of things seen as sinful, whether it's musical instruments, makeup, I think was one of the ones that he touches on, and books and other things that you might think, and then draw a line to kind of what happened here with John Knox and that idea of things. So this is kind of where it began, really, as you said before.
Well, I mean, we are living in the world that Savonarola created. It's the birth of Puritanism.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, it is the reason America is the way it is. If you extrapolate ludicrously, no, but it is the birth of Puritanism, and it is the birth of denial of physicality. It is, but what he was trying to do there was create alternative festivals to the Bacchanal festivals that were traditional in Florence. So he's trying to make, these great visuals, but the irony, of course, of the Bonfire of the Vanities was the moment was already past. This was the year before had been thousands of children from like 3 upwards, boys obviously, processing through Florence, through all the points where gangs would have traditional fights during Carnival, singing hymns, singing poems written by him. And by that point, they were already losing the city. Because he had promised them if they were holy enough, there would be no plague, there would be no famine, there would be no war. And there was plague, famine, and war. So he couldn't control those things. So already people are starting to think this is exhausting. And Puritanism, I mean, I could join a cult at any moment. I don't know that you, but I'm very, I love that stuff.
Susceptible.
Very susceptible. But almost to me, I mean, every march I've ever been on, by the time I get to the end, I think we don't really have that much in common in terms of agendas. Do you know what I mean? So I think I probably wouldn't be a keeper. I would be one of the people who was hiding in their house during the Bonfire of the Vanities. So it's lost its impetus by that point.
Yeah. Timing is everything in that sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a book which does encourage comparisons with today. It's a modern day Bonfire of the Vanities. Is that something that you fear, or has it already happened? Is it too late? I'm thinking about, books again being banned in America or being taken out of libraries for ludicrous reasons. And even just things like cuts in arts funding and things like that. The arts, it's maybe a different attack on the arts, but it's still an attack on the arts. And I just wondered whether that was something that, obviously would concern you, but you wanted to represent in the book.
Very much so. And I think very much the way it is in the book, they're removing any possible relics of Savonarola by pulverizing his bones and tipping him into the river. And at the same time, they've missed the actual means of communication. I mean, I see you've got all these beautiful books in the background, and I hold my books to me like they are relics, holy relics. I mean, each book could be the thigh bone of St. Ursula. So I think books are the new relics. Sometimes people get first editions and they're all like, oh, and it's been touched by the author, it's been signed, and they just want the special one, and they put it on a little altar. And And I think in exactly the same way, they're banning books in the States, they're trying to ban ideas in the States, they're trying to ban the dissemination of information, but the internet is there.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same mistake. You can, if you ban books, all you do is make them more attractive to young people. It's mad.
Yeah.
What are they thinking? Yeah, do you know what I mean? You can't, it's a misstep, it's a total misstep. And you're just, you're making yourself irrelevant. But I do think at the same time, isn't it quite exciting that what we do is so dangerous that lawmakers in regressive regimes are trying to stop us? I think that's quite...
Ideas are so, people's ideas, people's passions, whatever it is, you're like, oh, we want to dampen those and cut them out. Yeah, you're right. It's
that's how powerful what we do is. Do you know what I mean? That's amazing.
Yeah. It put me in mind of coming home as a teenager, probably preteen, with an Ozzy Osbourne album cover. My parents thought I was going straight to hell. We're not allowed to listen to that. He's got an upside down cross on the cover, but and so you're right. People will see, younger people will always seek out the forbidden or the kind of what the group above them, the generation above them don't approve of.
I was talking to Andrew Hagen actually, and he'd just done a collection of Burns poems. And I said, if you want young people to read them, you should get all the dirty ones together and ban them.
The Frankie Goes to Hollywood theory. Yeah.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? Because people are interested in forbidden ideas. There is a kind of beauty to that. And the idea that you can superimpose your values. But the Bonfire of the Vanities, actually, I mean, one of the really interesting, I got sidetracked all over the place, was Botticelli actually joined the cult and was a really fervent member. He never painted the same again. He never did Birth of Venus again or anything like that. His work changed fundamentally. And there's a story that he gave several of his old mythological paintings to the Bonfire of the Vanities. He donated them. He was present at the Bonfire of the Vanities, right, and he was present at the year before. His brother was very into it as well, and he had a breakdown, and basically he never really made a living after that. It's really sad. I mean, there are casualties of these things, of very kind of excitable social movements. There are always casualties, and what have we lost because of that? So I mean, these things are very damaging. They're not just like And actually, Michelangelo heard Savonarola preach and said, he was about 19, and he said, I am getting out of here. And he went to Bologna, and he really never went back to Florence. I think, really? It freaked him out. He said when he was 80, he was asked about it, and he said, I can still hear his voice in my head.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is a kind of Christ-like or John the Baptist thing about him, isn't there? There is that kind of I am going to suffer for you, that sense, even when he's considering, he knows he's going to die, and he's considering his form of execution, which is horrific. I'd never heard of that before either. What's the term for that? Begins with an S.
Strappado.
Yeah. There is that feeling. Do you think that's how he saw himself, or would that be blasphemy to him?
No, I think that's exactly how he saw himself. Now, there's a tradition of self-mutilation in the Catholic Church, which, I remember being very into that when I was a child and doing things like buying, you might remember fruit polos. Do you remember that?
I remember fruit polos, yeah.
All right, fruit polos, the poor man's spangle. I loved them. So I bought a packet, and as a self-denial thing, I tucked them in behind a statue of Our Lady in a park, and then I went back about 4 days later looking for them, and they'd all melted. But there is a real Catholic thing about hurting yourself, about an imitation of Christ, and it is you offer up the pain of that. But I think for people like Savonarola, looking at them from a modern point of view, he was very clearly anorexic. He fasted himself to the point of death several times. He was self-harming to quite an alarming degree, and one of the reasons that he was very, very weakened by doing these things. And I think it's I think people, because we now think S&M, people think someone's getting their jollies off on it, but it's not really about that. It really is about identifying with the pain that Christ went through and trying to imitate that and offer it up as a way of taking away some of the pain of Christ. And so it's like a real physical thing that I think he was much too into. I think he hated his own physicality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that obsession with self can often lead to that, again, the simple thing of being rejected, but taking it so hard. There's a bit of that in it, is when you're kind of obsessing about yourself. You draw comparisons. I mean, a lot of historical novels, you draw comparisons with the present day, but you do it quite specifically on a couple of occasions. You mentioned the Vietnam War. You say like Florence and San Francisco and draw those comparisons. Why did you choose to do that?
Well, I wanted this book and Rizzio to be kind of conversational. Being a crime writer, I think crime writing comes from an oral tradition of storytelling. And so I think we tend to think of the novel as arriving fully formed on the page, And actually, I think the history of crime fiction goes back to oral storytelling. So there are conventions from that. One of them is that you can have asides, you can have a narrative voice that's quite clear and quite ephemeral. You don't have to write crime novels for the ages. It's not going to be chipped into stone. It'll probably be read and thrown aside, but it might fundamentally change the zeitgeist. I think that's really interesting, the idea that books don't have to be forever. I think that's brilliant, and that you can say things like, in fact, I did leave some things out that I felt would age too quickly, like references to Modi, references to Erdogan, references to Trump even, please God, that won't be relevant. But I do think that when you're, as a non-historian writing a historical book, it's quite nice to own up to that and say, this is the perspective I'm writing it from. And this is I am looking at this through the prism of now, instead of that historical thing of pretending that you have a broader vision rather than just the present moment.
So you've mentioned Rizzio, which was your entry in the kind of Darkland Tales series that Polygon are doing. And again, historical figure. How do you approach, is that how you approach your writing history then? There's research there, your stuff, but it's the crime writer in you, the kind of person that's saying, well, I can be, maybe playful's the wrong word, but I'm going to have fun writing this as well. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are things in crime writing, because you can't assume the audience are going to read it. They're not going to read it so they can boast about it at dinner parties. They're not going to, do you know what I mean? I think the low down, dirty crime fiction that does its job doesn't get picked for book groups because it's just there to enjoy. And I think a lot of those techniques can be used in lots of different contexts. Narrative trajectory, pacing, there are lots of tricks in pacing that don't always get used. Like Lee Child says, when you have violence and things happening very fast, take your time, which is so counterintuitive. And you don't often see that in literary fiction. Often, it happens off stage or it's very quick and I think also, as I think if you come to writing a story with the idea that it is an oral delivery, so what you're saying is listen, you start with teasers and you go on to bits and you use contemporary language. You don't say wherefore to it as a verb, you just get on with it, and you want the audience to keep reading to the end instead of putting it down and going off and, thinking about it. You just want them to plow through it because it's got its own pace and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's what I felt reading both Rizzio and Three Fires, is it's got the pace of your crime fiction,
Oh, good.
Do you think of it as crime fiction? I mean, do you think of Three Fires and Rizzio as part of your crime back catalogue, for want of a better word?
Yeah, but I mean, I think, crime fiction, historical fiction, I read comics as well. I think those categorizations are marketing categories.
Yeah.
You shouldn't really, and I think writers, we don't really think that way, do we?
No.
Do you know what I mean? You don't. So it's weird because if your first book is a crime book, you're always a crime writer.
Yeah.
If your first book is literary and then you write a crime book, you're not a crime writer. I mean, it's just a marketing ploy. I mean, I see stuff sold as crime fiction that isn't crime fiction, and it sells really well because people think, well, I might enjoy that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's really relevant in Scotland in particular, where, you know, the whole idea of crime fiction is, it seems to me, the most popular genre of books that are out there. Certainly it gets, you know, it's got its own festivals, more than one. And yeah, it is marketing because you need to put them somewhere in the bookshop. But it does seem to be that I don't know if anyone's done any research into this, but do you get better sales if you're on that table rather than, say, the Scott Lit table or something like that?
You do.
Yeah.
I mean, I can tell you do. But the reason, you know, why crime writing has its own festivals, because when there were literary festivals, one or two of us would be invited.
Right.
Right. So we were never getting invited. And there are a lot of, I mean, I was a judge for the Women's Prize, and they wouldn't consider crime fiction. So we're very, very often excluded because we're a commercial form, you know. Yeah, so I mean, I think having been excluded from lots of things in alternative culture sort of built up.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think it's that balance between what people want to read and what people want to review or criticize, and you know, that should be, there should be a greater crossover in those things, I think.
Well, I think we should maybe be a bit more reader centric, but I do think it is, you know, because status is so ephemeral in what we do, people are desperate to work out who's above who. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the idea that it's so weird, isn't it? Because you and I are not particularly interested in that, but a lot of other people really are. So the idea that, you know, like one art form is more significant than another is not really about the readers. It's a collusion between all of us and our little society of weirdos who have houses full of books, which is dead unusual. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, you know, I mean, you don't strike me as someone who's particularly interested in garnering status or courting state. No, it doesn't. See, but you must have noticed that that's quite unusual in our world.
Yeah, I guess so. Certainly with writers, I don't think about it in terms of what I do, but certainly in terms of how people think of writers, not necessarily writers themselves often.
Yeah.
I might be wrong
no,
about
right.
that.
Well, I think writers themselves really, you know, most of us are very collegiate, but there is the notion of genius, which, you know, does hang like a bad smell in a lift, you know, of the white cis male heterosexual moody guy. You know, Lucy Arigari says there's no such thing as genius, that what we perceive as genius is just a big social performance. Now, who gets to make that social performance is, you know, people who are very well supported, have a life, people who are, you know, very secure in their funding, get paid big advances, you know, and it's like a performative cluster of being moody, not producing a lot, not engaging, not being enthusiastic about other people's work. I mean, I can always tell when someone's caught up in that, and I feel sorry for them. Crime writing's very collegiate. We all read each other's work and love each other's work and learn from each other. You know, but that is like that single individual who is kind of lifted over the head. I was at the Edinburgh Book Festival. I had this amazing international writers conference 10 years ago, and it was so interesting because like 85% of the writers were just like, "Oh my God, I've read you. You're amazing." But there were like 15% who were wearing hats indoors. They were swishing capes. They just couldn't. They couldn't join the body of the Kirk.
Yeah.
You know, and I felt, and they had entourages, and they would make statements. Some of us split off, and we had a little group of writers talking to each other, because it was like we were always talking out to the performative space instead of talking to each other. It was like we're really missing a trick here. So we had split off groups where we would all talk to each other, and certain people wanted to come. You could tell they wanted to come, but they couldn't bring themselves because they thought it would dilute their, I don't know, you know, just very isolated and special, so special.
I wonder if that's changed at all in selling a lot of books, making a career as one of those people is almost disappeared now. You know, and that certainly in the last, say, 5, 6 years and doing a lot of interviews with people who are independently published or small publishers or just starting out, is that there is that collegiate and supportive thing. And it kind of reminds me of what's happened in music, because people are not becoming huge bands anymore and they're often on indie labels or they've got other jobs to do, or all of those things. There is this sense, Scottish jazz is a great thing at the moment. The young jazz musicians are so supportive of each other and they're playing in each other's bands and all of those things, that the old idea of the jazz genius who maybe sits in his garret and plays his, smokes his gulwaz and plays his saxophone is maybe dead. And I wonder if it's a similar thing that, you know, none of us are, everyone's struggling here, so let's struggle together.
And what a lovely thing, because we're all learning from each other. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it looks really vibrant and interesting. And, you know, the idea that, I mean, really, when we're talking about the individual genius at the top of the pile, what we're really talking about is someone sucking resources away from everybody else. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, the kind of Miles Davis character, I mean, he is brilliant. And he brought loads of people up with him, actually, which very often gets forgotten. Do you know what I mean? Like, he brought so many people up with him. But at the same time, you know, it is so much nicer to be a writer and to be, you know, interested in one another and to be like, you know, because of Creative Scotland, a lot of us travel the world together. And I'm not just talking about crime writers. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? I mean, they do have, you know, we do go places together and we all stand in a big pasty crowd and look at the healthy foreigners.
Going back to the Edinburgh Book Festival, it's interesting. I've been looking at this year's programme to do a kind of preview of it, and it is more varied and diverse and welcoming, I think, across the board than it certainly used to be when I started going.
Yeah, it really, really is. You know, I'm writing an opinion for the New York Times, and talking about diversity in publishing, because publishing is really trying, you know, but it is like moving a super tanker. Festivals are different, but it is like you are moving it by degrees, tiny degrees. But there is the real will there, because we all know we're missing out.
Yeah.
When all we hear from is like a monolithic culture, we're not hearing those diverse voices. We're not getting access to those alternative points of view, which are really intellectually stimulating, you know. But I think festivals have really changed. It's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So talking about crime fiction, I just got your new book, The Second Murderer, which is a Philip Marlowe mystery. Tell us a little bit about this. How did you come to be involved writing Philip Marlowe?
Well, the Chandler estate approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in doing this, because they hadn't had a woman. And obviously everyone's thinking about diversity. And I said, I would love to do that. Now, I don't know if you've read a lot of Chandler.
Read a bit, but mainly through the kind of films. My dad was a big fan of those noir films, so we saw The Big Sleep, things like that, yeah.
Right. Well, he is an absolutely brilliant writer. Do you know he was at school with P.G. Wodehouse?
No, I didn't know that at all.
They were both at Dulwich College. They missed each other by a term, and they both use simile and metaphor in the same way, in a really startling way. I think they had the same English master. You know, they're both very concise. They're both, you know, very focused on the scene rather than the narrative trajectory. I mean, there's so many parallels between them. And P.G. Wodehouse, just like Chandler, you know, I loved them and read them, and then fell out with them because the Chandler uses the N-word. Yeah. The women are terrible. You know, he's really homophobic. I mean, there's one particular scene where, I mean, he's just like really, you know, problematic now. So I said, you know, I would love to do this. But another thing that really bothered me was the question of artistic estates. Because whenever I see those estate books, you know, like Sophie Hannah does Agatha Christie and all that kind of thing, I always think, what is going on there? What's the arrangement there? So the arrangement there is you write like, you know, a few chapters and a plot outline, and then publishers see if they want to publish them. You don't get any money up front or anything like that. You have to be a real fan to do those things. So I thought it would be great to write a Philip Marlowe book and have women in it, and have Jews in it, and have people of colour in it, and just take him to all the places he never got to go, because his LA is very small. It's just rich white people and poor white people. That's basically all it is, you know. But at the same time, you know, that does take you into the problem of, do you have the right to do that? You know, should writers just, would I like that? I mean, I don't know what the hell Chandler would think of it, but I think you know, he has such a great voice. And then what are you doing? Are you channeling his voice? Are you channeling his world? Are you pretending to be Chandler? He became very bitter, you know, and quite the bag of hate, actually. I think he thought, and also Marlowe sort of morphs from the early books of being quite self-depreciating and funny to being quite hateful. And so I sort of stuck a pin in the early books and tried to write in that world and used some of the characters. There's a character called Anne Reardon, and she appears in Farewell, My Lovely. And she's a brilliant character, and then she just disappears. You know, so, but I mean, it was great fun to write it, and I can tell you're a researcher as well. And you know, there's so much documented stuff. Like there's a gay club. He goes to a gay club at one point, and that was a real gay club.
Right.
There's no, you know, there's no lesbian clubs in the whole of LA now, which is shocking, actually. Not really? One. Yeah. Yeah.
Surprised by that. I've not been to LA for many, many years, but that does surprise me.
Yeah, there's people holding signs up in Pride this year. But yeah, so anyway, I had a ball writing it. But I mean, it does throw up lots of ethical questions, and you know, what right have you, and you know, approach problems as well. It was brilliant. It was fascinating.
I think you can tell that you enjoyed writing it, because there's this a real sense. Because having known the style, I was thinking, well, how are you going to approach this? Is it going to? Because you got I would imagine it's a fine balance between writing in the style and tipping into spoof, the kind of dead man don't wear plaid type of thing, you know, that has been done before. Was that something that you were aware of? You're thinking, well, was it difficult to get the voice, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Actually, the voice was, the tone, the sort of plot tone and the world tone, I didn't find difficult. Some things are very difficult. No one says, yeah, then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you have to come up with like sure, or no one says okay. So, you know, there are lots of conventions, sort of, you know, dialogue conventions. Also, what I did was I do tend to think visually. So at one point I went through a chapter and just drew lines for punctuation. Like, how often does the sentence end? What does he do in a paragraph? How many commas does he have? Because I'm a fiend for commas. You know, he never uses semicolons. You know, no dashes, no brackets. It's not conversational. It's just like, this is what happened. And also he comes from that tradition of, I mean, even he was channeling Dashiell Hammett.
Yeah.
So he's copying someone else. And Dashiell Hammett's style came from, Dashiell Hammett was a Pinkerton man.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so he was a Pinkerton detective. So the style that he writes in, which is the noir style, was the house style of Pinkerton reports. They were told never to have commas. They were told to make statements. They were told no adjectives, no adverbs, just stick to the facts. So if you read Hammett, he is writing in that style. And that became the house style of all the detective story magazines. Right. Then Chandler copies him. So just knowing that history kind of clears it up a little bit.
Oh, that's amazing to think that it was done out of necessity, and then is copied as a style, which then goes on to be copied, you know, elsewhere and becomes almost stereotypical as noir.
But also, you know, that style, people credit Hemingway with the American style, but he was a newspaper man. So he's writing in a newspaper style, which is get the facts down, no adjectives, no adverbs. But do you know where Alan Pinkerton came from?
No, I don't.
Glasgow.
Really? Wow.
He grew up in a tenement that is on the site of Glasgow Mosque. And he left Glasgow because he was a Chartist. And he was run out. He was being persecuted as a Chartist for suggesting extending the franchise. And he went off to America, and that's where he set up his agency.
That's amazing. That's great. Yeah, it all links up, you know. But it sounds like part of it is going down these rabbit holes and going, oh, where does that bit come from? Where does that bit come from, you know? And going back to Three Fires, it's clear that there's that as well. Is that part of the joy of just writing in general, is finding where it takes you outside of the actual writing?
Do you know, I cannot believe I get to do this for a living, because it is my bliss. It is just, you just become obsessed with something, and then, you know, get up and do some mopping and think about, you know, Buddhism and the Reformation and, you know, where did Martin Luther get his ideas, and, you know, just get really sort of stuck in ideas, and those little morsels really kind of bring it alive. But Three Fires was on the radio, and I'd written it as a sort of 5-part episode for performance. So it was Kieran Hodges did it, and he was absolutely brilliant. But I did it in a different voice. I did it in a PG Woodhouse voice, actually. I tried to do it in a PG Woodhouse voice.
Okay.
And he was perfect for it. He was so well cast for it. So I wanted it to be like a sort of uncle telling the story to a naughty child who's been made to stay in for some reason. And I thought I would just be able to transfer that and publish it. But actually, it didn't work. And there was more to do. It just didn't work on the page in the same way that it did. Yeah, so I had to rewrite the whole thing. Yeah, and leave loads out. That was the thing. I had to leave loads out. But it takes real courage and maturity to say, yes, that is fascinating, but I'm not going to put that in because it doesn't work on the page. Yeah, it's really difficult.
I worked as an editor for a short while, and that was always the thing, to try and get people. See that chapter you've done on flying birds of prey in Asia? It's really interesting, but it doesn't fit in this book, and It is a difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, and you have to listen to an editor. You know, Jamie Crawford came up with the idea of Darklands. That was his idea, and he asked me to do Rizzio, and he's the one who's commissioned all of them. And so I was asked to do another historical book, which is where this idea came from. But I thought, I can't do another Scottish story because it'll look as if I'm taking over the Darklands series, you know? And yeah, and other writers are doing their own ones, and it'll just look like you're a big attention hog. So that was so I was sort of on the lookout for another story because I'd enjoyed doing that one so much.
Would you do more in that style?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And I was thinking about your books in general, and what does come across them all, whether it's historical or Marlowe or your own stuff, is this enjoyment that you get from writing. It absolutely shines out. I think that transfers to the readers as well.
Oh, that's lovely to hear.
You don't get the sense, oh, this artistic struggle and going back to what we're talking about, the literary genius, thinking, wow, this is someone who's written this really enjoyed writing it and getting that over. Is that
That's lovely?
Is that too simple an idea, or is that pretty much right?
No, yeah, spot on.
Yeah.
And I think being grateful that you get to, you know, as I get further on in my career, I know what a miracle it is for anybody to make a living. And I know what a miracle it is to get books out. And I know what a miracle it is to meet a reader who has read your book, you know, and I see better people than me coming up. And because of the model, the economic model that we have now, they are not going to make a career of it. They're going to, and I see the you know, ferret trap of teaching, swallowing up a lot of people. I see, you know, good girl, people pleasing behavior where people take on admin tasks, work that isn't paid. Do you know what I mean? Everybody think, you know, you'll get exposure. You won't get exposure. It'll eat your year, and you won't get your book done. You have to be a bit of a bastard, and you have to be prepared to say, I'm not doing that because there's no money in it, and this is my job. It's not my hobby. And I'm sorry, I'm not married to a barrister. This is my actual job. So with all that, you know, coming to writing and getting books out, make sure you enjoy the desk, I would say, because I think some people enjoy the performance or they enjoy having written, but I actually love sitting down, and I'm aware of what a privilege it is to be in that position, you know?
I talk to a lot of writers, and they often say, oh, I don't know, when I finish a book, I think I can't go through that again or everything. But with you, I always think, when's the next one? What can I do next? You know, let's do Constantine in comic books or something like that. You know, that's the sense I get. Can we go right back to the beginning briefly and talk about Garnet Hill? Because two books came out in 1998, I think was when it was published. Is that right? Two books came out that year, which made me go, this is the Glasgow I know today, and that's quite rare. It's not something historical. It was Garnet Hill and A.J. Close's Forsaken. I think they both came out at the same time. Was that something that you were thinking about when you wrote it, that you wanted to present the city that you knew rather than one that had maybe cast a stereotype over it from the past?
Absolutely, because I only came here in 1986, and I moved here because I ran out of money. I was kind of on the run, and I came to Glasgow and fell in love with it. And I thought, I have never seen this represented ever, any bit of what I love about this place. I'd seen hard men stories. It was all very macho. Everything you heard about was fighting, razors, drunk men, macho interaction. And the city that I saw was jaw-droppingly beautiful, beleaguered, but jaw-droppingly beautiful. The people were absolutely amazing. And I think those 3 books in the trilogy really are a love letter to Glasgow. And as it turns out, a rapidly kind of disappearing Glasgow, because it's quite, I mean, there used to be an Italian cafe on every corner, even the Equis shut, do you know what I mean? So that was what I wanted to do. And I just wanted to represent women that I knew, and, the world that I knew, and the city that I knew, and had fallen in love with so much. And so to start writing, because I did love crime fiction, but it was incredibly misogynistic. And so this feels really like sort of the culmination of a project to get to rewrite Chandler and have women who have ambitions beyond getting a boyfriend, which is all the women are all obsessed with getting a boyfriend in Chandler, and to have fully realized gay characters. There's a character in that called Jimmy the One. Now, Jimmy the One was a famous Glasgow character, and he was an out gay guy in the 70s. And Jimmy the One saved so many lives. He died about 2 years ago, but I wanted to commemorate Jimmy the One in that book because he was an absolutely astonishing man. And he worked in bars. He was a barman, but he would see men that were having breakdowns and kept inexplicably waking up in Buchanan Street bus station or getting lifted or whatever. And he would speak to them and he would say, "I'm gay and I'm out and it's all right." And he saved so many lives. And I just wanted to, just put him in it. Do you know what I mean? Because then every so often I meet someone and I can say, "Hey, Jimmy the One's in that," And he's very handsome in this, which he wasn't necessarily particularly handsome, but he's his ideal self in this. Do you know what I mean?
I was going to say, because in the book, you've got him as this a kind of men love him and women love him, and he could be wearing a barrel, I think, and you thought, I need to get myself a barrel, which is a great, because there are people like that just fall out of bed and they look great. That's the thing. Whereas the rest have to work a bit harder. but that's lovely to hear that that's based on the real character. And go back to something you said earlier about communication and having to get the language right. There's also a lot of non-spoken, non-verbal communication in it. Like Marlowe picks up that there's a character doesn't like him and he can't work out why he doesn't like him, but that's all kind of done just through, almost unspoken ways of communicating.
And it's the butler.
Yeah.
And when you see these very grand films from like the 30s, 40s and 50s where they all live in big houses and they've got butlers, there were houses like that in LA at the time, and they were staffed entirely by actors who were acting the part of these service jobs. Do you know what I mean? How interesting that is. I just think that's such a beautiful metaphor for the whole of LA. And north of Sunset Boulevard, which was a bridle way, it was like a bridle path. North of there was where all the movie stars lived, and they all had stables. They all had stables. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like just like everybody did horse riding because it was the posh thing to do. That's what posh people did. So it's a very different city now, and very few cars. There's loads of film of LA at that time, and people put a camera in the front of the car and they went round filming their route around. Just like loads of different streets and stuff like that. And it's all just wee bungalows and big empty spaces. And, it's very unpopulated. But it was on the cusp of a huge corruption from all this money flooding down from Chicago, mob money, because they all moved down there because they couldn't be caught. And somebody was telling me, actually, the reason that the movie industry was in California was because Thomas Edison had the copyright on film, and he lived in New York. So by
Right.
the time a cease and desist letter on the basis of copyright arrived in LA, it would be like a week later. So that they all moved out there to get away from the copyright demands of Thomas Edison. It wasn't for the light. I always thought it was for the light. But so it's always been a rogue city, you know.
Yeah. And it's interesting, that's the kind of, if when I was in LA, you would think everyone serving you was either an actor or they had a script that they wanted to read or all that kind of stuff. But then playing the butler, I mean, that's a different level altogether, isn't it?
Do you know? Because
With the English accent put on and everything that, yeah.
do you know what I mean? Like everything is a performance, you know. But then that's true of butlers here as well.
Of course, yeah.
You
As
know?
we know from upstairs, downstairs, and all of those things. So what's next for you, Denise? Have you got anything, you know, what are you working on? Can you tell us that? Is there going to be another Philip Marlowe? All of these things.
Well, I'm writing a book called Unthinkable, which is basically a look at, and this may be something that you experience, as you get older, you become assimilated into the establishment.
Mm.
And how can you become implicated as you become maybe more financially stable, you stop seeing. Do you know what I mean? Because when I was young and I had nothing, I used to look at people with bought houses and think, how can you not appreciate what's going on with folk like me? And it's really interesting to see how you seep into that. You know, the honours system, you know, directorships, being invited to parties. It's harder to slag off Rupert Murdoch if you've been at a party with him.
Mm.
Just all those little, small, corrupting things. And I think that's, you know, I think what would it take for somebody who has been assimilated to stand up and say, this is a lie? And I was thinking particularly about climate change, actually. And I was thinking, you know, what would it take for us all to say, right, no more cars or planes? What are we going to, what would it take for somebody to step out of that power structure and all the insidious little ways that you get kind of sucked into it? It's very hard to resist. I mean, I call myself Dame Denise Mina as a signal that I don't agree with the honour system, right? Because I was getting soundings about an OBE for your work in literature, and I mean, I know you're obsessed with music history, so you know I was watching 1971, that brilliant documentary, and it was about the Stones going to, you know, spending time with all these upper class people. And that's how that happens, is you get these radicals who come from their normal background, and the next thing they're hanging about with toffs because that's the only people that have the same amount of money as them. And their story is blunted because they are now part of that. They're no longer part of what we are doing. We don't own them anymore. And I think, you know, I think that social process is fascinating.
I was listening to a radio show on Britpop that's on at the moment, and it was going back to that time where Tony Blair had the Gallagher brothers round, or maybe it was just Noel, whatever, but that kind of thing. And
Yes.
Noel being quite defensive, going, well, you know, I've met Tony Blair, to Steve Lamacq. Steve Lamacq's going, very good. But, you know, that's the kind of thing. It's that, you know, suddenly you forget where you're from and you forget who you are, maybe.
Or you lose your independence because you're collegiate and you're nice, right? So I remember that happening. I remember thinking that's a mistake. You know, even if you like both of them, that's a mistake. That is a blending of, you know, you're crossing the streams there, to use a Ghostbusters analogy. And that is a mistake, and that is not what the arts are about. The arts are about questioning. The arts are about, you know, remaining outside. What you can do is you can just swear everywhere you go. Do you know what I mean? But you and I were at a very posh dinner party that we accidentally went to, and that felt very implicating, and that felt very like, I'm going to be honest with you, I love all that. I love the country house.
Yeah.
I love not being worried about money. You know, I've had nothing and I've had money, and I can tell you which I prefer.
Sure.
But at the same time, that's not most people's experience. So are you going to write about, you know, who are you writing to?
Yeah.
And I think we all make promises to ourselves when we're young. And, you know, I had two promises to myself. I wouldn't forget what it was like to have nothing, and I wouldn't get bitter. And I'm struggling with both of them. You know, it's just something that happens. You get older and you start noticing things you don't have, or you start worrying about, you know, different things. And also, you know, I find my eyes slipping away from folk that have nothing, slipping away from friends who are renting out houses at extortionate prices, people who have second homes. You know, you should not have a second home. people don't have one home.
Yeah.
People can't buy houses in Plockton that live in Plockton because you've got a lovely wee house, you go there twice a year. That shouldn't happen. Do you know what I mean? And also, I mean, I meet politicians and I like them personally, but I'm not getting my picture taken with them. I'm very clear, but I do not want that. I don't think that's right. You know, even if you fundamentally agree with somebody, we should not be doing that and allowing ourselves to be assimilated. Their lives are shorter than ours. They may be very nice, well-meaning people, but we're doing a different thing. And you're just giving it away.
And there's a legitimacy that you're giving. You don't know what these people will do in the future, even if you agree with what they've done in the past. Blair being a great example of that.
Oh.
So you've got a prime minister who's wanting to attach some cool and credibility, and then you've got someone else who's wanting to see what the establishment is like, dip their toes in, and then, you know, you've got all these. That's really interesting. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Denise, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I could blather away to you for ages, but it's been a real pleasure.
That was great crack, Alistair. Thanks so much for talking to me. That was lovely.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.